Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to our fourth Scholar Sessions. Want to welcome you all to this members-only program that serves as a thank you for your great support through us, especially during these difficult times. We have a great program lined up for you tonight. So if you're all ready, I'll go ahead and I'll turn things over to our CEO, Erin Carlson-Mass, for some introductions of our great speakers this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. I'd also ask all of you to keep yourself on mute for the duration of the presentation and the speaker discussion, but don't hesitate to add your questions as they come to you in the chat box. And when we get to the group Q&A portion, my colleague Joan Cummins will either read your questions or invite you to ask your questions using your voice. It is my pleasure to introduce two of our board members and our speakers this evening, Mr. Michael Kahn and Mr. Thurgood Marshall Jr., to the special program on Abraham Lincoln and the Supreme Court. This program was inspired by both recent events, which also resulted in a considerable amount of attention being paid to an article that we shared on our website that Mike wrote years ago titled, "Lincoln's Appointments to the Supreme Court, a Master Politician at His Craft." Mr. Michael Kahn has studied, lectured, and written about appointments to the Supreme Court for 4 decades. Over that period of time, whenever appointment controversies have arisen, he has been sought after as an expert from radio, television, and print media. His scholarly article on Lincoln's appointments to the Supreme Court is once again drawing his views into the public domain during the current appointment and confirmation debate. Mr. Kahn lives in San Francisco, where he's a practicing attorney and an active participant in numerous public and private charitable and business activities. Mr. Thurgood Marshall Jr. works at the intersection of law, business, politics, and policy. He has practiced law, held senior government appointments, and he serves on an array of corporate and nonprofit boards. During nearly 2 decades as an international law firm partner, Thurgood represented witnesses and companies involved in congressional investigations, and he counseled clients engaged in public policy. Thurgood served in each branch of the federal government. He began his legal career as a law clerk to U.S. District Judge Barrington D. Parker of the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia, and he practiced corporate law before working on Capitol Hill. Thank you, Mike and Thurgood, for joining us. And Mike, will you please start us off by sharing your presentation on the background?
Sure. Good afternoon to those of you on the West and evening in the East. On October 12th, 1864, 3 weeks before the presidential election of 1864, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney died. Under Article 2, Section 2, Clause 3 of the Constitution, Abraham Lincoln could have immediately filled the vacancy by making a recess appointment. George Washington made the first recess appointment to the Supreme Court. In 1795, he appointed Chief Justice John Rutledge to the Supreme Court. Lincoln himself, 2 years earlier, in October of 1862, appointed Justice David Davis to the Supreme Court as a recess appointment. All told, hundreds of judges, including 10 Supreme Court justices, have been recess appointments, including William Brennan's appointment by Dwight Eisenhower in October 1956 during Eisenhower's re-election campaign. The questions posed today are, why did Lincoln decide to wait until after the election to fill the vacancy? And why did he choose Salmon Chase, one of the people in the whole world that Abraham Lincoln disliked the most? To answer these questions, we need to understand the historical context. So let's look back in 1860. We think today that the country is divided and the Supreme Court is critical, but things were much worse in 1860. In fact, in summer of 1860, the election really was going to determine the fate of the United States, and a decision of the Supreme Court was at the heart of the controversy. The 1857 Dred Scott decision was a thunderbolt, which incensed the North and emboldened the South. Now, Abraham Lincoln, I want to show a few political cartoons, which is one of my other vocations. And let's turn to the first one. The Dred Scott decision was a critical issue in the 1860 election. This is a cartoon which shows the 4 candidates. Yes, there were 4 parties run for president in 1860, and Abraham Lincoln is at the top right, and he's dancing there with an African-American woman. And this shows what the position of Abraham Lincoln was about Dred Scott. Abraham Lincoln said that Dred Scott was wrongly decided and it should be overturned. And he made it clear that he wanted the Supreme Court to change its mind and get rid of Dred Scott. The other candidates here embraced Dred Scott in one form or the other. Douglas is on the left corner, one is Bell, and Breckinridge are the other two. So let's clear the screen of that as we move on. So that tells you the context in 1864, in 1860 at the time of the election. Now let's turn to 1861 to 1864. Abraham Lincoln did not like the Supreme Court as constituted. He thought that Roger B. Taney was a threat to him, and that Roger B. Taney might interfere with his prosecution of the war, including possibly invalidating his positions on the draft, habeas corpus, greenback financing, and emancipation. So what did Lincoln do? Well, Abraham Lincoln was a very, very clever politician, and he ran the government to his own purposes. And so with respect to the Supreme Court, between 1861 and 1864, Abraham Lincoln had 4 parts of a program. First, Lincoln only nominated men, and yes, at that time, only men were nominated. He only nominated men to the court who were supported by vigorous, widespread campaigns for the position. What Lincoln basically did was he announced to the world, I have a vacancy, and if you want to become a Supreme Court justice, you can campaign for it, and you can have your friends campaign for it, and you can have your friends write me letters and get newspaper articles and get endorsements. And that's what he did with his first 3 appointments, and he had very, very great success in doing this. In fact, Abraham Lincoln appointed 5 justices to the Supreme Court, and in total, every single one of them was unanimously confirmed except one, and that was 1 vote against. And they were all almost instantaneously confirmed. And that was because what Lincoln did was he had a consensus developed around his appointments. Second, Lincoln's litmus test for appointment was that a candidate must be anti-slavery. The candidate must be pro-union. And he also wished to have candidates who were very likely to support his war effort because he knew he was doing controversial things. So Lincoln made a big effort to screen the candidates and be sure the views of the candidates were consistent with what his views of the decisions the Supreme Court should make. Third, and this has a modern resonance, as do these other things, Lincoln worked with Congress to pass 2 judiciary bills. And that is what Biden is talking about when he says he's going to consider to appoint a commission to investigate the Supreme Court. Well, what Lincoln did is he had 2 judiciary bills first passed. The first bill reoriented the circuits. The circuits are, today we have the Circuit Court of Appeals, but there were no Court of Appeals then. At the time, there were district court judges and there were Supreme Court judges who rode around in the circuits. And they got on a horseback and they, or in a stage wagon, and they went to the various cities in their circuit. Well, there were 9 circuits at the time. And what Lincoln did was he rejiggered them because the vacancies that were occurring on the court were in the southern circuits, and he wasn't going to appoint a southern justice. So he had a judiciary bill, the first one, and it rejiggered the circuit so he could appoint judges from the right place. And then later, he announced that there'd be a 10th circuit. He had a judiciary bill that added a 10th circuit. And yes, Abraham Lincoln packed the Supreme Court. He was so worried about the court, and he was so concerned about the possibility that the court might do bad things to him, that he cooperated with the judiciary, with the Congress, and they passed the judiciary bill to add the 10th circuit. Fourth, with his judicial and military advisors, Abraham Lincoln did everything he could in his power to avoid important decisions coming to the court. And you might ask, well, how did he do that? What he did was he did everything he could under color of the military. And if you note, the Emancipation Proclamation was a military declaration. And the reason he did that was because the courts always historically had given special deference to the president when he did something as commander-in-chief. And so what Abraham Lincoln did was as many things as he could under military cover, and otherwise he took actions to keep things out of Roger Taney's jurisdiction. Well, let's show the second cartoon here. Now, this cartoon if we take a look at the bottom, this is a cartoon critical of Lincoln, and it shows that what I just said was not lost on commentators. Now, this comes from the London Punch, which was very critical of Lincoln, and it shows Lincoln rising from the ashes of burning the states. It says there, states' rights, habeas corpus, credit, free press, United States Constitution, commerce. And the criticism throughout the country was that Lincoln was acting like a dictator, and he was avoiding these issues, and he was violating the Constitution because he was keeping things out of the courts and doing things illegally. And Lincoln, I'm sure if he saw this cartoon, would have thought, well, this is a compliment. It shows I'm getting away with exactly what I'm trying to do. Well, let's turn to the beginning of 1864 and set the stage. As 1864 dawned, the war effort was not doing very well, and the public was not very happy with Lincoln. And during the spring of 1864, Abraham Lincoln had doubts about whether he was going to be renominated. Now let's take a look at the third cartoon. So this cartoon, this is published in the spring of 1864, and it talked about what Lincoln was experiencing, which frankly Donald Trump or Barack Obama didn't experience, and that is, or Bill Clinton, for that matter. When they ran for re-election, they had virtually no opposition. Well, Lincoln had lots of opposition when he was running for re-election. But one of his very chief opponents was his Secretary of Treasury. And if you look right next there, standing next to Lincoln, holding the greenback dollar, was Salmon Chase. And Salmon Chase, the Secretary of Treasury, made it very clear that he thought Lincoln should go, although he never said it to Lincoln's face, of course. And he conspired with his friends, and he hoped to oust Lincoln. Also next to there is Benjamin Butler and other well-known people. So Lincoln was worried. Lincoln was worried they would not get reelected. And Lincoln also, at this time, wasn't very happy with Salmon Chase. So in the spring of 1864, what did Lincoln do? You can take that cartoon down. What did Lincoln do? Well, he basically formed a new political party. He changed the name of the Republican Party to the Union Party. And by May of 1864, Lincoln had pretty well secured the nomination of the Union Party. And then he sent his people to the convention. And what he had them do was fateful for the history of the United States of America. Abraham Lincoln dumped his vice president. And instead, Abraham Lincoln, quietly and denying it all along, engineered the selection of Andrew Johnson. Now, Andrew Johnson was a Democrat. He was a senator from Tennessee, who is the only Southern senator that stayed in the Senate when the South seceded. And he was a great friend of Abraham Lincoln's policies. He curried Lincoln's favor. And he was quite popular among Democrats. And he was the personification of the moderate border state kind of guy who supported Lincoln. So Lincoln chose Johnson. Why did he do it? For political reasons. He did not do it because he thought he was going to be a great president or a good man. He did it because he needed the votes of the moderates. People thought that Lincoln was too radical, or some did, and the people who were opposing him didn't like the war very much, and he was trying to appeal to that segment of the population. Now, lest you think that that just like his handling the Supreme Court was not observed by people, let's take a look at the next cartoon. And here's what the reaction to that was. Well, Lincoln had famously said, "Don't swap horses in midstream." Well, this cartoon shows that this is a response to that. That in the middle is John C. Fremont. And John C. Fremont ran for president in 1856, and the first Republican candidate ever. And Fremont was famously very, very anti-slavery. Lincoln made him a general, and the first thing he did when he was a general is he freed all the slaves in the state of Missouri. And Lincoln was furious about that, and Lincoln reversed that. And so this Fremont was sort of the personification of the radical position that Reconstruction should be hard and slavery should be abolished immediately and unequivocally. And when Lincoln appointed Johnson after the convention, very shortly thereafter, John C. Fremont announced the formation of a party to run against Lincoln. And here you see the reaction of one cartoonist. Lincoln is trying to cross that river, that famous river. And if you take a look in the middle, he's riding the horse named Expediency, and he's drowning along with Johnson to his right. And you have John C. Fremont who was in favor of justice. They see his sword and principle crossing the river to the White House. So Abraham Lincoln did the expedient thing. He tried to curry favor. He made the political choice of Johnson, and he drew fire from the radical wing of his party. Well, let's fast forward to the fall of 1864. Now, the fall of 1864, after the summer, Abraham Lincoln's reelection chances had improved. What had happened was his buddy Sherman had taken Atlanta, and there had been some elections. In Maine and Indiana and other places, the early returns, not for president, but for other congressional districts and other governorships, were pro-Republican. But Abraham Lincoln wasn't confident. He was very much worried that he was in trouble anyway. He thought he had the soldier vote, but he couldn't be sure. Of course, there were no polls. He didn't wake up every morning and get a look at 17 different polls like we all do today. And he was worried. And this was the state of affairs when Taney died. Taney had been very sick, and Abraham Lincoln got the news that Taney died. And he's in the middle of a tough election. So what did he do? Well, Abraham Lincoln immediately announced that he wasn't going to make a decision now. He said instead he would listen to the public. Now, you hear about what the dog whistle? Well, this was a dog whistle to the campaigns. It unleashed the campaigns. Everybody said, okay, Lincoln wants to hear from us. And so people started campaigning like crazy for Supreme Court justice. He got letters. He got visits from people, his supporters, and some from his enemies. People visited Mary Lincoln and said, please appoint this person or that. Newspaper articles were written. Endorsements were written. It was a frantic campaign. Now, there were three different basic segments of the campaign, and this is very important. One segment was from the moderates, the same group that kind of liked the Andrew Johnson appointment. They said, look, you want to calm the public down. They're worried that you're going to be too radical. You're going to be an abolitionist president. You're going to do abolitionist things. Get somebody appointed to the Supreme Court who's going to calm down people. Now, remember, there had been draft riots in New York. There had been a lot of problems with the policies that Lincoln had that looked the emancipation wasn't all that popular. And so that was a credible position. You want to improve your chances? Do what you did with Johnson. Appoint Montgomery Blair. He's a Democrat. He was your postmaster general. Now, there was another group that said, wait a minute. You've always said you wanted to get rid of Dred Scott. You've always said you wanted to reverse this. This is your chance. Appoint a real radical. Charles Sumner, we've all heard of him, famous senator from Massachusetts who got his head bashed in by Preston Brooks. He was a leader in the Senate, and he went immediately at the ceremony for Taney's death. He brought Lincoln aside. He said, today, appoint Charles Sumner. Appoint Salmon Chase. You've got to show the country that you mean it. We're getting rid of slavery. The promised land has been reached. You can appoint him. You'll have 5 votes in the Supreme Court. You'll have done it. And there were lots of other people who agreed with that. And there was a big campaign by the radicals. And Lincoln felt a lot of pressure. Now, there was a third faction. And that was the faction that said, wait a minute. The Supreme Court's too political. We should not make it political. Let's make it apolitical. And don't you remember, you talked about elevating Justice Noah Swain, and you could appoint this wonderful lawyer, Everts. I think, in fact, he spoke at your Gettysburg Address. He's a really terrific guy. And you appoint a great lawyer, and you can elevate a Supreme Court justice, and you can make it clear to the public that the Supreme Court is not political. Now, let's put ourselves in Lincoln's shoes and think about his problem. Let's take a look at the next cartoon. So this is what Lincoln was facing in 1864. He was running against McClellan. Here this says the true issue, that's what's the matter. And it says Lincoln, no peace without abolition. And it shows Jeff Davis, no peace without separation. And there's the solution to the problem. General McClellan, who's running on the peace platform. Peace, that's what we need. We don't need to get rid of slavery. What we need to do is get the Union to come back, the South to come back, and what we need to do is end this awful Civil War. So those are the people, that was who Lincoln was running against. That was Lincoln's problem. So we can take that down for a second. So this was Lincoln's dilemma. Should he repeat May of 1864 strategy? Should he select a moderate justice and even a Democrat and appoint them to the court? And by the way, Dwight Eisenhower thought that was a good idea. In 1956, he appointed William Brennan, who was a Democrat. Eisenhower had been sick. He had a heart attack. He was trying to reassure the public, and he appointed a Democrat in 1956. Well, Lincoln could have done the same thing some 90 years before. From a political standpoint, that might not have been such a dumb thing to do. Yeah, the radicals were mad at him, but where were they going to go? They weren't going to vote for McClellan. They had no choice but to vote for him. So the swing votes, the border states, the people in New York was really a close state, they might have been fooled that Lincoln was really not that strong on slavery. And that might have been a good thing to do. So he could have done that. And in fact, if you are cynic about it, Lincoln was one smart guy. He would have known, if I appoint Montgomery Blair, everybody will be happy with me in the Democrat camp, or a lot of people will. And guess what? In December, the Senate won't confirm him. The radicals will never confirm a guy like that. And then I'll have my cake and eat it too. I can win the election, and then I can get a strong supporter of reversing Dred Scott. Now, that would have been the smart thing to do, the political thing to do. He didn't do that. Here's what else he could have done. He could have done what Mr. Trump did. He could have fed red meat to his base. He could have said, I told you I'm against slavery. I told you I'm going to get rid of Dred Scott. We're going to appoint Chase immediately. We're going to do this recess appointment. He could have done that. And he had problems with that group. He had vetoed the Wade Davis bill, which is a Reconstruction bill. The radicals were mad at him. They said that he just wasn't sufficiently aggressive in promoting the emancipation, which was his policy. And this would have been a way to ameliorate that part of his base. But he didn't do either. He waited till December of 1864, and then he appointed Salmon Chase. I'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, let's answer the two questions. First, why did he select Salmon Chase? Well, he selected Salmon Chase for ideological and principled reasons. He did not select him for reasons of politics. Lincoln believed that Chase was going to be solid at the Supreme Court on two issues. He was worried about emancipation. Remember, the 13th Amendment didn't get passed, and if you saw Steven Spielberg's movie, it didn't look like it might have been passed. It was a tough sell. So Lincoln was worried that the emancipation was going to come up before the Supreme Court, and he wanted somebody who was going to be absolutely solid on that issue. Second, he was worried about the legal tender. He had issued a lot of greenbacks, and he was worried about the financing. And he believed that he had Chase dead on both issues. Chase was clearly going to reverse Dred Scott. He had said so. And Chase, of course, was involved in the legal tender because he was the person who issued the greenbacks. So Lincoln knew that if he appointed Chase and during his presidency after the war, the two most important things to Lincoln, the financing of the country and reversing Dred Scott, would be taken care of. Now, why didn't he think other people would do this? Well, the answer is found in a quote, and this is a wonderful quote. And as I read this quote, I want you to all think about the so-called Ginsburg rule, because Ginsburg didn't make it up, Abraham Lincoln did. And here's what he said: "We cannot ask a man what he will do. And if we should, and he should answer us, we should despise him for it." Lincoln chose Chase because Chase had already answered the questions, and he was afraid what Evarts would do, and he was afraid what Blair or anybody else would do. Lincoln made a principled decision when he chose Chase. So why did he wait? Well, from Taney's death, October 12th, until the election 3 weeks later, all of the candidates, the moderates, the radicals, and even the supporters of the Supreme Court, a non-political choice, they were campaigning like crazy for him. They were tripping over themselves to say to Lincoln, "I am supporting you, you're my man, we'll do anything for you." And Lincoln was getting a lot of juice out of his non-decision and a lot of support. Now, there's a lot of speculation, and even in the popular press now, oh my gosh, he made a deal with Chase. Chase would campaign for him. Well, Chase actually was campaigning for him a month before the election, before Taney died. And yes, Chase supported him, but so did the other people. People from all the campaign camps, the supporting Supreme Court justices kept supporting him. Lincoln was shrewd. He was a smart guy. And he realized that while his decision on the Supreme Court was in doubt, he would get a lot of support from all the factions. But if he decided and announced it, he would throw cold water on one of the camps or two of the camps, and he might not get such enthusiasm. So if he chose Blair, he might get less enthusiasm for the radicals. If he chose Chase, he might get less enthusiasm from the moderates. What was the benefit in that? So Lincoln made a political choice to wait. The reason Abraham Lincoln waited was because he was holding together a faction, and he believed that was the smartest way to go. So the answers to the questions are: he chose Chase for principle, and he waited for politics. And I'll close with a more uplifting note. Abraham Lincoln's choice of Chase demonstrated his character. Abraham, let's go to cartoon number 6. This is how Abraham Lincoln felt about Salmon Chase. Can you lift the caption here? There it is. Mike, remove the salmon. Salmon Chase was an arrogant person, and he didn't hide it from Lincoln. And he was difficult. He was hard in the cabinet. He was difficult. He was running against Lincoln, and Lincoln really didn't like him. And there are very few people Lincoln really didn't like. When Chase resigned, either for the 5th or the 3rd time, I'm not sure which, Lincoln finally accepted the resignation, and this shows you how he felt about it. He was glad to be done with Chase. Then came the appointment problem. A lot of people pointed out, you don't like Chase very much. You don't want to appoint him. And Lincoln said, I don't hold a grudge. I'm going to do the right thing. And he decided to do the right thing. So did he do like some presidents do? Did he hold a press conference? Did he make a big fanfare? Did he write a letter to the newspapers? Nope. He didn't tell anybody. No one knew what Abraham Lincoln was going to do. He decided to do the right thing. And the morning of December 6, 1864, he took his pen out, and in his own hand, he wrote, I nominate Salmon Chase to the Supreme Court of the United States. He put it in an envelope, he gave it to a messenger, and he had him send it down to the Senate. The Senate got it, and within a couple of hours, the Senate unanimously confirmed him. Salmon Chase learned that he had been confirmed as Chief Justice of the United States before he knew he was nominated. Lincoln took no credit for it. He didn't brag about it. He didn't pretend that it was his own personal glory. He just did the right thing quietly, and he moved about his business. And that was a real show of character. Very few people would have taken the position that I'm going to exalt and empower a person who had behaved so badly as Chase. But Lincoln thought it was the right thing to do, and he did it. And with that, that's my presentation.
Thank you so much, Mike. That was wonderful. And that gave us so much great context and detail of the history. So, without question, Salmon Chase was politically ambitious. And one of our members who's listening in commented on him being a pain in Lincoln's backside too in the comment section here. But even after Chase became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he continued to harbor presidential aspirations. You mentioned Sumner lobbying for Lincoln to pick Chase, but did Chase ever personally and directly lobby Lincoln after he left the cabinet?
Yeah, he did. Chase left the cabinet, and then he got really nervous, and he wanted to be appointed to the Supreme Court. And he went to people and said, can I talk to Lincoln? And Lincoln met with him twice. But the most important meeting was held, of course, at the most important place in the city of Washington by far. He was summoned by Lincoln to the Soldiers' Home. And he met in our Lincoln Cottage. Thank you, Thurgood, for your picture of it. He met at the Lincoln's Cottage, and he was hoping to have a one-on-one with Lincoln and persuade him to appoint him to the Supreme Court, but he was disappointed because Lincoln had some other people with him. But he did his best to tell Lincoln how loyal he was and how he was going to support him. So yes, he did. He tried personally to influence Abraham Lincoln, and I kind of doubt it had any effect at all on Lincoln. He also wrote a letter. Famously wrote a letter, and Lincoln just said to his clerk, just file it. I'm not going to read it. However, Lincoln did get a visit from Schuyler Colfax, a famous politician who, toward the end of the process, Colfax went to him and he said, "I promise you that Chase won't be running for president. I make that pledge. He's gonna do the straight and narrow." And I don't know what Lincoln said, but I'm sure he said, "Yeah, I'm not buying that bridge."
Thanks, Mike. Thurgood, do you want to add a question here?
Thank you, Erin. And Mike, thank you so much for the presentation. I find that it's difficult for me to get through a conversation with you without jotting down a number of new items and stories that I should research and delve into further. And tonight I've got a rather robust list, and for that I'm grateful to you. Thank you. I wanted to ask you a little bit about David Davis's recess appointment that you referenced. We are all familiar with recess appointments, and I am in particular because of service in the government, but also as a family matter. My father, as you know, was recess appointed by President Kennedy to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, and he served with at least 3 recess appointees on the Supreme Court. You mentioned Justice Brennan, who was one of President Eisenhower's 3 recess appointments to the court, Potter Stewart and Earl Warren being 2 of the others. And looking back in history, a number of presidents used that device not only to fill executive branch positions, but also judicial positions, including at the court. And as you mentioned, David Davis was indeed one of those beneficiaries during the Lincoln administration. He was our 35th Associate Justice, and indeed the 9th recess appointment to the court. So what I wanted to ask you about was what may have been behind the appointment and whether you can help shed some light on President Lincoln's decision to recess appoint him. I know that some have suggested that that appointment reflected President Lincoln's desire to shore up support at the court for the Emancipation Proclamation. And you mentioned that as an important concern with the Chase nomination. Others have suggested the Davis appointment was merely to curry favor with the Illinois electorate, and still others have used what I would call the Freudian explanation, which is he just happened to be the right person at the right time. And I was hoping you could shed some light on that.
Sure. Well, none of those are true. What happened was this. In something like April or May of 1861, Lincoln had 2 appointments. He had one, John McLean had died. He was up from Ohio, and at the time, Ohio and Illinois were in the same circuit. And so that was a problem. So what he did was he did the judiciary bill. He waited for 6 months, and he got the judiciary bill done in December, and he split Illinois and Ohio into different circuits. That allowed him to choose an Ohio person and an Illinois person. So he immediately chose Swain because Swain had used the 6 months to do a big campaign. Then he had to choose an Illinois person, and he was completely flummoxed. He had 3 close friends. Davis had been his campaign manager, and then there was a guy named Drummond who was a district court judge, and he was very, very close to Lincoln. And there was a fellow named Browning, and Browning was also close to Lincoln, and he was the United States senator at the time. He got appointed senator when Douglas died. Well, Lincoln had a real conundrum. There were 3 major league campaigns going on. Davis had Mary Lincoln whispering in Lincoln's ear, and a guy named Leonard Swett, who was his close friend, bugging him. And Browning had a bunch of people bugging him, and Drummond had a lot of people bugging him. And he didn't know what to do about this. So he procrastinated, and he didn't act on this appointment. And the months went on. Now, remember I told you that the judges ran circuit, Supreme Court justices. And the months started piling up, and there was no circuit judge in the Illinois circuit because the vacancy went on so long. So finally, in early summer of 1862, Lincoln gave it a lot of thought, and he decided, well, Browning's a senator, and I could probably, he'll be mad at me, but I can probably deal with it. And I don't know about Drummond, but I got a big problem with him. So he wrote Davis a letter in August of 1862. And he said, Judge, I'm willing to appoint you, but you got to promise you won't fire Drummond's clerk. because Drummond likes him a lot, and I want Drummond to have the only piece of patronage you're going to get here. So you got to write me back and promise he won't do that. And of course, Davis immediately wrote back and said he'd do it, and he'd appoint him. So now Lincoln, it's September, and Lincoln has to decide. He's now chosen Davis. He's got Davis's agreement. And the reason he chose Davis among the three is he thought that Davis had the best claim. Davis had been his campaign manager. And if you read about Lincoln as a lawyer, you know that Lincoln used to travel around the circuit, and the lawyers would travel in packs. And they would go from city to city, and they'd go to hold court for days at a time. And what Lincoln would do, he would go around and he would sleep in the same bed as another lawyer. That was what they did. The reason that's an interesting thing is because he slept with a lawyer named Speed, and he eventually put the guy's brother to his next attorney general. Well, they would sit and talk in rooms, and Lincoln would tell stories. And the leader of that group was the judge, and the judge was always David Davis. Davis was sort of Lincoln's mentor, and Davis was his mentor. He was the campaign manager in the 1860 election, and Lincoln thought to himself, you know what? The public is going to think he has the best claim. They don't know Browning or Drummond as well. And so it's my view, and I think pretty well held by history, he chose the person with the best claim, who the public would understand the best that he did. And the reason he did the recess appointment is he was getting so much heat from the people in Illinois for not having a circuit judge that he finally decided he needs to do this. And he actually didn't know about it. He had to go to Bates. It wasn't that common then, and Lincoln didn't really know much about recess appointments, but Bates, his attorney general, told him to do it. Now, there's a addendum to the story, and that is Davis didn't like the deal. He wasn't about to go ride circuit. He was a very, very heavy man, and it was very inconvenient and unpleasant for him to do it. And he wasn't about to ride circuit unless he was confirmed by the Senate. So Davis actually never assumed his seat in the Supreme Court until December, when the Senate came in and they confirmed him immediately. So that's what happened with old David Davis.
What a yarn. Aaron, can I ask one more?
Please, Thurgood, keep going.
Okay, so Mike, thank you for that. You've alluded to a number of considerations that were very much a part of President Lincoln's decision process, and you've also ruled out others at different times, whether they were political or policy-oriented positions. Can we glean from President Lincoln's judicial appointments that he had varying profiles or roles in mind, just as a general ideological matter, or more importantly, temperamentally, for his Supreme Court nominees? For example, President Lincoln's cabinet appointments have been described as a team of rivals. In your assessment, did his Supreme Court appointments reflect a similar philosophy or template? That is to say, did he nominate some with William Brennan or Sandra O'Connor-esque political skills who he may have hoped would make use of those skills to build consensus among the justices?
That's a great question. And the answer is no. And the reason I say that, I'll describe the perfect Lincoln Supreme Court justice. Abraham Lincoln was a really fine lawyer, and he was a scholarly lawyer, and he appreciated scholarly lawyers. And so he appointed Swain, and Swain was a lawyer's lawyer. Everybody thought he was a great lawyer. And he was not a politician at all. He had political people who supported him, but he was a very fine lawyer. And then the next appointment was a guy named Miller, the first justice from Iowa. And Miller was a towering genius. He had been studied to be a doctor. He lived in Kentucky. He was anti-slavery, so he moved to Iowa. I think I have Miller right, not confused with Swain. But in any event, I'm sure of this. Miller was absolutely revered as a scholar. And of the 140 representatives, 129 signed on for his appointment to endorse him. And Lincoln was very taken by those characteristics. Davis was a smart guy, but Davis was a crony. And so Davis was a one-off. Then the third appointment was a guy named Field. And David Field was from California. And he was also known to be quite a scholar in California land title issues. And that was a big problem. Now, he was also the brother of Cyrus Field, and Field was known to Lincoln. But again, all of these people had in common, they were not politicians. They were not like Roger Taney was Attorney General, for example, under Lincoln. A lot of Supreme Court justices, and of course, Marshall was, I think, Secretary of State or something under Washington. That was not the template Lincoln was looking for. Chase was the exception. And the reason Chase was the exception, although everybody thought Chase was a smart guy, nobody thought he was a great lawyer. But for Lincoln, the sun rose and set on Dred Scott. He could not be sure that he was going to win the issue of the 13th Amendment, and he wanted Dred Scott to be thrown out. And I must say something else. I'm projecting, but I'll project since I have the podium. I think Lincoln knew that Roger Taney, although he wasn't right in most of what he said, that a really good judge might affirm it. And I think he thought that Everett's and anybody else who's a really good judge in his former template might be risky. But he knew Chase was going to be solid on this issue. So I think that, yes, Abraham Lincoln was a scholar, he respected the law, and he wanted judges to be the same. And just to point out in that regard, in each of the campaigns against Swain, Miller, and Field, there were competitors that were either senators or some, political figures. And Lincoln, didn't seriously, I think, consider them. A final note in that regard, another sort of historical anecdote. Those of you who are Lincoln fans know that William Seward thought he really was president. And when he became Secretary of State, he thought he was prime minister and he was going to run the government. And in proof of that, as soon as he got to Washington in 1861, he had papers drawn up for a guy named John Crittenden from Kentucky to be appointed to the vacant Supreme Court seat. And that was Seward's view. Seward wanted a politician who was going to be a moderate and maybe helpful in the war effort. And all we know is that Lincoln put the kibosh on that very quickly because that wasn't the kind of person that Lincoln wanted on the court.
Thanks, Mike. I'd like to invite everyone else who's joining us tonight to go ahead and add your questions or start adding your questions to the group chat. And while we're waiting for your questions to come in, Mike, I wanted to ask a little bit more about the issue of court packing, which you referenced. And you also touched a little bit on what other presidents have done with regard to filling recess appointments, for example. But I'd like to ask about how Lincoln's success compared to that of both his predecessor, Buchanan, and his successors, and in particular, Johnson. You cover that a little bit in your article too, Mike, and you mentioned that Lincoln got 5 Supreme Court appointments, including the Chief Justice. So how did that compare to Buchanan and Andrew Johnson?
So Lincoln was a genius at this. He did not get along that well with Congress. Everybody knows that. He fought with the radical Republicans and he had a lot of difficulties. And of course, they were very critical of his war effort. Yet he just slam dunked 5 Supreme Court justices, got them all appointed immediately. Andrew Buchanan tried to appoint a Supreme Court justice after the election, and he appointed his Attorney General, who was actually quite a popular man and thought to be a scholar. And the Senate wouldn't go along with it. They didn't even give him a vote. They denied it as procedural grounds. It's even worse for Johnson. Of course, Johnson didn't get along with anybody, and he tendered a Supreme Court justice. Here's what the Supreme Court did. They said, not only we're not going to confirm your justice, we're going to take away the seat. So they eliminated the seat. And then they said, and by the way, if you have any idea that you want to appoint another Supreme Court justice, we're going to say the next Supreme Court justice that goes, we're going to reduce the Supreme Court to number 8. And that's what happened. So Andrew Johnson didn't appoint, he appointed one, didn't get him appointed, and he lost the seat. Then another justice died, and that automatically reduced the Supreme Court to 8. Then Ulysses Grant had a tough time too. He appointed a bunch of people who didn't make it. The Senate, before and after Abraham Lincoln, reared its ugly head and made it very difficult. But nobody was as clever as Lincoln or as successful as Lincoln in handling this. And the whole notion of court packing was one of the great PR failures in American history. What just astonishes me that even today, almost 100 years since FDR tried that gambit, people are still using the notion court packing, because actually what this is just the judiciary bill sizing the Supreme Court. There was talk in 1861 of changing the Supreme Court to 5 justices, and that you can limit the jurisdiction. The Senate can limit the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. The Senate can increase or decrease the size of the Supreme Court, and certainly the Congress has the right to change the jurisdiction of the court. All those things are well within the powers of the Congress, and those are things they do all the time. Not all the time, but they've done a lot. But FDR made such a huge PR blunder that it's still sticking with us 80 years, 90 years later.
So our first question comes in from Eileen. Eileen, would you like to ask your question with your voice?
Okay, hi. Goody, it's so good to see you. You know, we worked in the Senate together a few years ago, but it's good to see you. So I just wondered, how did Lincoln's appointments, once they were confirmed, meet his objectives? Because we always hear that a lot of justices act differently once they're on the court than what they were expected to do.
Well, I think the first thing to say is, unfortunately, people, by the time they started making decisions as a court, it's not quite clear that they understood exactly what Lincoln's objectives were, because unfortunately Lincoln died in April of 1865, and there weren't that many cases. And how it played out, what the Supreme Court did was in the context of an incredibly contentious relationship between Johnson and the radicals. Basically, Chase and the court upheld much of what Lincoln did during the Civil War. What they didn't do was uphold the legal tender cases, and they actually, in a 4-3 decision, they ruled it was unconstitutional what Chase had done when he was a Secretary of Treasury. And I have never actually seen an analysis longitudinally about how all the justices did. Chase did not give up his ambitions to be president, but he was very unsuccessful. So I would say that it's very hard to know, to measure how the Supreme Court did, because if Lincoln had been president, there would have been a different actualization of Reconstruction. In a different, it would have looked different. He would have been in a different relationship with the Senate, and the Supreme Court issues would have been different. So I would say the verdict of history is difficult to come to because there's so much speculation of what would have happened if Lincoln had been president. I realize that's unsatisfactory, but that's kind of the best I could do.
We did have a specific question from Harold with one of those what ifs related to that decision on legal tender. If Lincoln had lived, how do you think he would have reacted to this overturning of the decision on legal tender?
I don't know, but I don't even know that Chase would have done it. I mean, Chase was not exactly a man of high moral character. He was a sort of a smarmy kind of guy, and he might have sustained. It was 4-3. He might have sustained legal tender if Lincoln was alive, not being able to look him in the face. So it's hard to say, and I really can't answer that question.
Chris, would you like to ask your question with your voice?
There we go. Hi. Wanted to ask, once appointed, did President Lincoln have much communication with his appointees?
Well, he definitely communicated with Davis as his friend. It is not clear to me that Abraham Lincoln ever met the other appointees. You have to remember they didn't spend much time in Washington. They were on circuit. So the people that so let's take Swain and Miller and Field. Field was out in California. Swain was in Ohio. Miller was in Iowa. That's a long way from Washington. And they came together for just a very few weeks a year. The court didn't meet that much. You know, I don't have any evidence of it. They're big, thick books. I probably could look it up. But certainly, I've never read of any interaction between the Supreme Court justices, except Davis. And of course, he didn't have much to do with Chase in the 4 months that Chase was Supreme Court justice before he died. So I would say, you know, probably not very much, and it would have been very surprising if he did. And he definitely didn't know these people, 3 of them, before he appointed them.
We also have a question from another person named Joan. Joan, would you like to ask your question with your voice?
Hi, I have 3 questions actually. One is, how did it come about that there were so many vacancies during Lincoln's term? Sounds like 5 in one term. And then I'm wondering how he got confirmation so easily when you say the presidents before him and after him couldn't get their choices confirmed. And then I'm wondering how the circuit system worked. When the justices were going around on circuit, were they acting as intermediate appellate decisions, and then the cases went later to the full Supreme Court? I just don't know how that works. Wonder if you could enlighten us.
So in answer to your latter question, I'm not entirely sure the technical basis, but the appellate courts were not established till the 1890s. And yes, that's their function. The circuit court, they performed as circuit judges. I'm of the impression they actually tried cases also. But whether there was actually appeals to them or not, I don't know. But they had jurisdiction over that circuit. And so if matters were working their way to the Supreme Court, I think they went through the circuit court judge. But the principal purpose of them was actually to render justice in the circuits. So I think they actually tried cases. It was very ugly duty, very arduous service. And there were lots of people who thought that it was terrible and they should change it, and that it took forever to do. Swain and Davis were independently wealthy. The justices were not paid very much, and they lived in pretty awful conditions, and lots of people didn't want to be Supreme Court justice, certainly not in the hinterlands. Now, how did the question was, how did he get out the appointments? Well, of course, he made one for Field, so that's 1. Tawney died, he was really old, that's 2. Justice Campbell was a Southerner and decided to go for the Confederacy, that's 3. Justice McLean was very old. He had been appointed by Andrew Jackson in 1829, and he died in 1861, that's 4. And the 5th one, and the 5th one was the carryover from Buchanan. Peter Daniel died in 1860. So he got 1 from Buchanan, he got 1 secessionist, he got 1 who was older than dirt and died, he got 1 who was older than dirt's dirt and he died, and then he made 1. That's how he got 5. That's the answer to that question. And I'm sorry, what was the other question? There were 3.
How did he get the confirmations?
So he was a genius. While he did the judiciary bills, he focused on the fact, well, we're going to have 1 Ohio and 1 Iowa, and the Iowa people. He basically cultivated the Iowa people and said, well, maybe I'll do it for you, maybe I'll do it, but you really have to show you have somebody fabulous. And the Iowa people just went crazy with this guy Miller. And by the time Lincoln was ready to choose, Miller had so much support that there was no viable campaign, no viable opposition. And that's kind of how it went. He engineered, he engineered it. He thought about it. The interaction between the judiciary bills being passed and the selection of the appointments, the only one he wasn't able to engineer was Illinois. And but the Illinois people didn't think it was seemly for them to oppose Davis, and they really didn't have any viable reason. It would have been just personal spite. So he did a really good job. The other thing he did, of course, was that the Republicans controlled the Senate. Radical Republicans controlled the Senate, and there was no sentiment really in the Senate for appointing somebody who wasn't, anti-slavery, and he clearly appointed people who were solid on that. But it was not an accident. It was very, very well thought out. Finally, again, speaking to my issue about the circuits, there was a need. So the first appointment he makes is in December. That vacancy had been since May, and they desperately needed somebody. Then the next appointment he makes a few months later, and those people had been almost a year. The next appointment he makes is 6 months later, and all these appointments are made when the people from the states are crying out, we need somebody to come ride circuit. We want a circuit justice. So there wasn't a lot of appetite to screw around with what he did. Now, having said all that, that didn't help Buchanan, that didn't help Johnson, didn't help Grant, but Lincoln was able to manipulate all those factors.
Excellent. We also have a question about the long-term impacts of Lincoln's appointments from Bradley. Bradley, would you like to ask with your voice?
Yes, thank you very much. Reconstruction was the nation's first attempt at a biracial democracy, and that failed, and we didn't get another shot at that until 1960s. I was wondering, how did Lincoln's appointees to the Supreme Court, how they vote on the Reconstruction amendments that turned back rights for African Americans during this time? I know that Miller was on the court till around 1890. Field was 1897, and Swain was 1881. So they all was on the court when the court turned back rights for African Americans. I would be interested in how they voted and a role that they played in turning back rights. Thank you.
Well, so the absolute specific answer on the specific cases, I don't recall, but I can tell you the overall context of what happened in the 1883 civil rights cases and the other cases that had very disappointing results. There were two factors that went against notions of equality that we today embrace. One was Lincoln was not, by today's terms, Lincoln and all of them were racist. They didn't believe in Black equality. They didn't believe in the rights of Black people to stand shoulder to shoulder with white citizens. They didn't believe that they should sit on juries. They didn't believe they should vote and things like that. So what they didn't like was slavery. And they thought slavery was a terrible thing for Blacks and for whites. They thought it debased whites. But our notions of racial equality and their notions of racial equality were not the same. So that the issues that were teed up, the movement toward more progressive notions of equality that we would see today, those were not things that they embraced. They didn't believe Lincoln did either. Now, would he have evolved? We don't know, but they certainly did not. Second of all, there was an experiment which was thought to be a failure, and that was the imposition of the Reconstruction policies before the time of 1876. And after that, the idea of states' rights being preeminent, letting the states do what they need to do, was the more dominantly accepted philosophy in the courts and among the legislators. So again, our notions of civil rights that certainly even from the 50s and on were not popular. I am not familiar with any of the justices being famous like John McLean, who voted against Dred Scott, or Harlan, who voted against Plessy. None of the justices, to my knowledge, were famous in that regard for upholding the rights of African Americans. But I don't want to besmirch them because I don't pretend to be a scholar of their voting. I'm more knowledgeable about the appointments, but from my recollection of the cases, none of them distinguished themselves. Finally, in that regard, Davis did not turn out to be, Davis turned out to be more like McLean and Salmon Chase than Lincoln would have liked. Davis had presidential fever too. So he certainly was not going to be an advocate for African-American rights. And he was in the court, I think, till the 1880s. And he famously was on the commission that decided the 1876 compromise. So in that regard, I'm sure Davis wouldn't have been a leader in advancing it. But again, it's very difficult to unpack what the points of view would have been, of what Lincoln's point of view would have been, and view it through the lens of history. If you read the Lincoln-Douglas debates, what Lincoln says about African Americans and his views would be viewed today as horrifying. It's just and translated into jurisprudence, it's just very difficult to reconcile with today's standards.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you for that question, Bradley. That's actually going to be our final one because we're a little over our time. And also an additional response to your question, Bradley, because I had been curious about that too. And I believe that, as Mike mentioned, Justice Harlan's the only one who upheld Plessy. And I think only one of Lincoln's appointments was left at that point, Field, and he was with the majority, but he'd been a dissenter in the slaughterhouse cases. So it's interesting that he had been in the dissent for one, but joined the majority in Plessy, unfortunately. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and a big thank you to each of you, our supporters. Our Lincoln Ideas Forum is this Thursday on October 29th from 1 o'clock to 2:30 p.m. Eastern. And if you're not already registered for that, I encourage you to do so on our website, lincolncottage.org. Our topic this year is presidential character, and we hope you can join us for that. Another huge thank you to Mike Kahn and Thurgood Marshall Jr. for joining us this evening for this important and timely discussion on Lincoln's Supreme Court appointments. Thank you all again and have a wonderful evening. Take care.